I know I had a young man who came up to me at a reading and a talk that I did at Aware, I think it was last year or the year before, and he said that his father, he was a young Punjabi man, he said his father is in his 80s and never reads anything but the sports section in the Straits Times, and he handed my book Erotic Stories to his father, and his father read it in 3 days and loved it, which made me really happy. And I think that has something to do with the idea of representation, the idea that we break these taboos when we see our people in these stories, when we see that we do these things and it's okay for us to do these things.
This podcast was presented as part of Night Spin 182.7 FM, a program curated by them, commissioned by Singapore Writers Festival, and organised by the National Arts Council. And you can listen to the 2 full episodes on swfspin.live now.
I'm Balli Kaur Jaswal. I'm very happy to be here. I am a novelist. I've written 4 novels. So the most recent was The Unlikely Adventures of the Shergill Sisters. My international debut was Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. I've also published some op-eds and essays about shame and taboos and censorship, particularly in small conservative communities.
The reason why we decided to invite you down today is to chat a bit about your first international book, Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows, and I think that that's very fitting for this year's theme of Singapore Writers Festival, which is on intimacy, right? So I think let's start off with talking a bit about the inspiration behind your book. Why did you decide to write it?
I think, as with all my books, there's always a growing fascination with something that then one day kind of culminates in, okay, now I want to tell a story about this. So for me, I think there was always a huge fascination with women that seem to be invisible in a society, and the idea of sexuality and how we perceive women and sexuality. So I think that was something, even though I didn't quite articulate it in those terms when I was young. When I first learned about sex as a child, like when I was, I think I was like in primary school when I first learned about sex, my first thought, I think everyone's first thought is, oh, my parents did that? And then you like find all these excuses, you're like, no, I must be adopted. or no, they were the ones that definitely didn't do that. And I think for me, it went, my parents did that, but then also it went further back to like, my grandparents did that. Because particularly like my grandmother in particular just seemed so asexual to me. And I think a lot of kind of traditional Indian women are perceived and portrayed by our society as not really having any sexual value or any sexuality. So I couldn't fathom that when I was young. And over the years, I kept returning to that question. The reality settled in, obviously, that, of course, the women of that generation did have sex. They had a lot of children. But what then bothered me more was, was that a choice on her part? She was very young when she got married. Did she know what was even happening to her? Because I've heard like some of my friends say that their grandmothers have told them much later in life, you girls these days are so lucky you know all these things, because I didn't even have it. I didn't figure out the connection between sex and having children until my 4th child.
Wow.
Yeah. So did not understand like all these things about their bodies and all these things about, their about this very, very fundamental thing. And to me, that was just endlessly fascinating. And I wanted to create a world where the women that kind of sex happened to, actually take charge and control their narratives. So Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows is not a collection of erotic stories for actual Punjabi widows, as a lot of people tend to think for some reason. It's about a young British Indian woman named Nikki who has dropped out of law school and is trying to redeem herself to her family. She signs up to teach creative writing courses at the Sikh temple in Southall in London. And she finds out very quickly that the women who've signed up for her classes have some interest in literacy, but more interest in telling their stories and in telling stories about sex, about things that they weren't allowed to talk about before. And so they start this illicit storytelling club that becomes kind of bigger and bigger and grows out of control.
So I want to know, what are some of the themes that you particularly wanted to focus on in this book, and why?
We start at different places with feminism and with activism, and with that sense of independence as well. Like Nikki's character, Nikki feels that she's very oppressed because she grew up in Britain, but her parents to her are very traditional. And then she meets these women who, you know, experience oppression on a very, very different level, on a very fundamental level. And she's a little bit impatient with them because she feels that they should be, like she kind of feels that her job is to liberate them. And there is this kind of colonial mentality that she comes in with, this very, you know, you're all traditional, I'm going to make you modern. She kind of feels like a savior. And I think that was the most fascinating thing for me to explore, was that we all start from different places, that these women do actually have quite a streak of independence in them, but they've been limited in how they could express that independence, and that's really not their fault. And a lot of their conservative ideals and a lot of their outlooks on the world were necessary for survival in the context that they came from. So I really wanted to explore how feminism across the spectrum is really, really informed by cultural context and history.
There are some themes like in the book that I saw you covered, including like arranged, like marriage, you know, independence, obviously sexuality. I'm wondering how much of that is a reflection of like your own upbringing and like personal experiences.
I would say a lot of those things were in the context of my upbringing. I think the idea that there was this kind of that after a girl got educated, then the next step was marriage, and that you had to have a purpose, you had to have a thing that you were doing, which I think is a very, I wouldn't say it's just a Punjabi thing, I think it's very Asian kind of mentality of like, you always need to be you know, hitting that next milestone, and you need to be doing something, and you need to have that you need to have a title, you know.
It's true.
You can't just be aimless. Like you have to stay on a treadmill. And Nikki's character doesn't. She goes to law school because she gets the marks to go to law school, and then when she's there, she's like, I don't care about this, and I don't understand what's going on. She hasn't really found her passion. And this idea of finding your passion is quite secondary to, you know, the pragmatism that I think our parents' generation had instilled in them and want to instill in us. Things are quite different for us. We have an enormous privilege to not prioritize pragmatism, to not have to prioritize survival. So for me, I think that tension for Nikki was very much there. And then there were other things too, like the confusion I think that I have found quite frustrating with arranged marriage versus forced marriage. Two very different things. Like arranged marriage is something that is that people do, that a lot of people are very happy with, and that is still done in a modern context around the world, with, you know, in the Indian diaspora. And really, if you think about it, Tinder is kind of a way of arranging, maybe not marriage, but arranging, you know, people together. There's a bit of ickiness to the fact that your parents are doing the arranging, and that's why, like, it was never for me. But I think that a lot of people conflate it with forced marriage and the extreme stories that they hear of, like, young girls being, you know, dragged into these marriages with older men in rural villages, and always associating it with violence rather than love, rather than, you know, this is what families are doing to ensure that their offspring are you know, happy and staying within a context that's familiar to them. So I mean, there are lots of nuances in all of those things that I was very, very curious about, and that definitely came from just my observations around me of, you know, relatives who did kind of favor the arranged marriage way of doing things, and who did have conservative views, and my silent rejection of those things that couldn't always be vocally expressed. But the pen is mighty in that way.
I think stories of like diaspora communities in like diaspora Asian communities, right, in like other parts of the world are quite, I won't say common, but there are many stories written about it and like commonly explored. But I think what makes your book really interesting is that you took like a spin with the erotic stories, right? I want to know a bit about the process of your research, because I'm imagining that you would have to put yourself in the shoes of like these women who are older Punjabi women, right? And then thinking about the sexual fantasies and like experiences. What was that like for you?
I think I grew up with a lot of the sort of like in the 90s there was this kind of a lot more space on bookshelves for Indian diaspora writers, particularly women, and in a lot of those stories, identity was the story. You know, identity, like the search for identity was the story. And I feel that as we've kind of built from that, we've been able to say, okay, yes, the search for identity is one aspect of it, but how about we, expand on this? How about we, unpack it and think about aspects of identity that we want to explore, like sexuality, like gender, and bringing in humor to that, bringing in dark elements of that as well. So I think that was what I was trying to achieve with Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows, was being like, well, our stories, yes, they can be about identity, but they can also be, about just a whole lot of other things as well, because we're multifaceted. In terms of research, I actually was only able to get to London after I had written maybe half of the novel. I had lived in the UK for a year when I was writing my first novel, Inheritance, and I had gone to Southall quite a bit because I had family friends there, and I found it fascinating. Like, I thought it was this place where India from the 1950s had basically been fossilized in London. So like the street signs, some of the street signs were in Punjabi. You could, at the time that I was there, you could pay for a beer at the pub in rupees, which I thought was really interesting. And there was something incredibly comforting about being in a new country and yet stepping off a train and suddenly being in a place that felt like your family was everywhere, that felt like home. But then, then I also thought, well, there's also a downside to this insularity, because it means that if you don't conform to this community, those same people that are always around you to support you can also turn on you, or can also reject you. Everyone knows everybody's business, it's not always a good thing. So I was really fascinated by that. And so when I went back to Southall in, I guess, 2 years into writing the manuscript, I had the characters in mind. I had Nikki, the main character, and I had kind of the different widows in mind. And I just kind of walked around observing things as if I was them. I spoke to a friend's grandmother and talked to some other people that she knew. And more of the details that I got were surrounding those intimate aspects of their lives. Were not actually, I didn't feel comfortable actually asking people directly. And after all, I wasn't writing reportage or nonfiction. But I did get a lot of good details about like when they got married, like how did they feel about leaving their families, what was it like when they met their husbands for the first time, so those sorts of things.
What was a common experience among these women?
A very common experience was that marriage just kind of happened. Like it was like they came of age, and
it's like the next step for them, right?
Yeah, and they were all they seemed to be quite young, like my grandmother, but they didn't actually go and live with their husbands until they were older. So that's a detail that I put into the book.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they were kind of promised to someone at the age of like 14, but they didn't actually go and live with their husband until they were like 17 or 18. So there's a little bit of time for them to kind of prepare for marriage. Although I had unanswered questions about, what that preparation actually looked like. So I think it was a lot of, here's learning how to cook. Here's learning how to, sew his buttons on or whatever. Yeah. I don't think there was any, I sense that there wasn't much warning about what to expect in the bedroom. And what they were allowed to say no to, or what they were allowed to do themselves. And so that was a curiosity that drove this novel. And yeah, as I began to kind of distinguish the characters from each other, I started to think of them as different individuals that I had seen around Southall, that I had observed, and built their identities from there.
I kind of want to ask you about how explicit you get in the book, but can you give me an example without like actually reading out or like keeping it like quite PG-13?
I mean, I think it's pretty explicit. There are parts where the women talk about, so there's a point in the novel where Nikki, the main character, asks the women why every time they talk about genitalia, they refer to it in terms of vegetables. Like they're like his aubergine, or like the banana or whatever, and then she realizes that is actually quite culture specific, because the women grew up, there's so much taboo and there's so much unsaid around sex that no one actually knew what the proper words were for genitalia. They only knew how to refer to those things in reference to things from their own world.
Yeah.
So they're in their domestic world of groceries, that in terms of size and shape of particular body parts, that was the best comparison that they could come up with. But then there's a part too when, interestingly, the women say, we don't know what these words are in Punjabi, so we use these, but we know what they are in English, and they all kind of rattle off the most obscene words in English for everything, because they've heard that around them, because they've lived in London. Their kids, they've heard their kids swearing and their kids saying those things, and I thought that was really fascinating, that there was this huge, like, it's such intimate things about ourselves that we don't have words for, don't even have labels for. I think that's really interesting.
I think that's quite common in like Asian culture, right? I mean, in Chinese also we do have like small little like parts that we don't term properly.
Yeah,
right?
And then the terms that you do have are like very vulgar, right? They're the kinds of things that like you wouldn't say that kindly. Like you wouldn't say, you're saying it as an insult. So it's either you can like genitalia, especially women's genitalia, is disgusting and insulting. It's the worst thing you can call someone, or it is unspoken of. Like there's nothing neutral or positive.
Yeah, a lot of shame and like secrecy around it.
Yeah.
So okay, I want to go on to how the impact of your book. So how was it received by your community?
That's a good question, because I have only actually heard very positive things. I've only been approached, by people from my community, and particularly young men, which is really cool. Yeah, particularly men in their 20s, young men who have seen this kind of discrimination, and who have seen the ways in which the communities can neglect women sometimes, or forget about sexuality in that way. Yeah, a number of them have approached me to say that they loved the book, that they introduced the book to their parents. I know I had a young man who came up to me at a reading and a talk that I did at Aware. I think it was last year or the year before. And he said that his father, he was a young Punjabi man, he said his father is in his 80s and never reads anything but the sports section in the Straits Times. And he handed my book, Erotic Stories, to his father, and his father read it in 3 days and loved it, which made me really happy. And I think that has something to do with the idea of representation, the idea that we break these taboos when we see our people in these stories, when we see that, we do these things and it's okay for us to do these things. So making the invisible visible for me is really, really important. As far as anyone who is unhappy about the portrayals in the book or anything, I've heard whisperings here and there, but it's, it doesn't really mean much to me if I'm not actually hearing it directly.
It's true.
I can't really speak about something that I haven't actually confirmed to have heard. Yeah.
But I don't know if, there might be a situation where some of like the elder women in the community who are a bit more conservative might find it extremely, how do I put it? A bit too much for them, right?
Yeah, again, I haven't heard from these elders at all, and I haven't really. I've heard, I've had sometimes like people say, oh, there was this thing that there was some talk that someone wanted to invite, like, young Sikh artists to, and then someone at the top said, oh, but don't invite Balli Kaur Jaswal because she always paints our community in a negative light. Which to me is very interesting, because I speak very, firstly, it's not in my interest to be a publicist for a community, like I don't think I portray the community in a negative light at all. I think I portray it as it is, and my whole reason for writing fiction is to get at the truths, and I don't think that it serves anyone for us to just say, no, everything's fine, we're model minorities, we're great, everything's working just fine, because it isn't, and that's okay. Like, every community has these issues. And I don't see how we're going to do better for everyone. I don't see how we're going to be more inclusive if we shut people out. But again, a lot of what I write about is kind of the insidiousness of that kind of, that whispering and that gossiping, and the people who try to kind of cut me out are actually doing all the things.
People, right?
They're kind of proving me right. Like, when I say that there's a network of gossiping aunties, and then a network of gossiping aunties actually do exactly what I'm like. You see, this is why I have to write about it.
It's true. Your book has a very special place in that it covers topics of intimacy, right? So, and I do think that intimacy is a very interesting theme altogether, because I only recently learned that there are actually 5 types of intimacy. I want to know how does your book explore like the other parts of intimacy, like emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and experiential?
So I guess intellectual and spiritual intimacy, I think that comes into the stories that the women tell. I think they're telling these stories in a building that's close to the Sikh temple. I had to make sure to like make it geographically like just a little bit outside the Sikh temple, so fundamentalists won't get angry at me for setting. Although I still have had people be like, "Oh, it's a bit sacrilegious for you to put," and I was like, "Well, it's within the vicinity. It's not in the temple." But I think the women see the Sikh temple as the spiritual hub and the place that's kind of the heart of their culture and their community. So for them to be kind of a little bit adjacent to it, and developing this other side of themselves, this side of themselves that has been oppressed, is and doing that through storytelling, doing that through sharing of experiences, doing that through conveying to others these narratives in which they're in control, in which they have this kind of starring role. That was what I wanted to reconcile in the novel, was this idea that they actually aren't at heads with each other. What these women are doing, and that's why I kind of had them adjacent to the temple. What they're doing is actually very as close to a spiritual experience as you can get. They're in a safe environment. They are talking about being, their fullest selves. They are making up for lost time in a lot of ways, and they are restoring that equality to relationships, that equality that the tenets of the Sikh religion was based on. The idea was men and women are equal, and they are counterparts to each other in an equal way.
How do you think your story impacts like the younger generation in helping them understand themselves better, and like knowing that being sexual or wanting to explore your sexuality is normal and okay?
I think stories are a really good entry point for anyone. That whole idea that our narratives are visible, that our narratives are important. when we read stories or we listen to stories about people like ourselves or people who have something in common with us. So like I grew up, without much until sort of my teens. There wasn't much in the way of stories about young Punjabi girls navigating Singapore. There still aren't, right? Or navigating life just anywhere. And that is kind of what I strive to do with fiction, and that's especially with Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. I just wanted to tell the truth, and I just wanted the stories of the women and the not just the stories that they tell, but also the stories of who they are. I wanted that to be an entry point for people reading that book at whatever age, so they could see the vulnerability in these characters and match it to their own. They could witness the shame of these characters and reflect on their own and realize that that they don't have to have that shame and that they're not alone in that shame. I think one of the biggest gifts that reading gave to me as a young child was the sense of there's more like you and it's okay. And I think that's what I strive to do when I write.
Tell me a bit about like your childhood and how stories played a role in like shaping your upbringing.
So I grew up in a number of different countries, and because of that, I think books were a very consistent presence in my life. I could always, rely on fiction to take me into worlds that felt certain, that felt that there was some sort of resolution. There were some ways in which the underdog could triumph. And then I think I just always was just very, very into stories anyways. Because I was such an avid reader, I guess my vocabulary kind of built a little bit faster than I wouldn't say my maturity, but my readiness for certain themes. And so, I remember there was this concern. One of my teachers, I think, was quite concerned because my mum had bought me a book that, like, I think I was like in primary 3, and it was a book that was clearly for teenagers. It was about some romance. Like there was this, silly kind of boy and girl on the cover looking at each other seductively or something. And there was a lot of shame around that. So there became a lot of shame around the idea that I liked stories or that I like to read stories or that I like to write stories. Like there became kind of this idea that was imposed on me. I think that I was only reading to find out like salacious things. And also I think there's still a little bit of this prejudice against reading for entertainment for children.
That's true.
Yeah.
100%.
There was a lot of snobbery as well about like what, like if you're enjoying it, it can't be good for you. It can't possibly be good for you.
I had like a teacher in like secondary school who I still remember until this date. I was like 15 and I was never like a science girl, so I always did badly in his classes. Okay, fine. So he hates me or whatever. It was a physics class.
Oh,
and
they're the worst.
yeah, and I can't remember what he was talking about. And he was talking about how like we should read more, which is okay, great. But he's like, you shouldn't just read like fiction books. So he pointed at me. He was like, what kind of books do you read? And I'm like, oh, I really like fiction books, and I often go to, at that point of time, Popular was a thing, right? I'll go to Popular and see like what are the best selling like fiction books. So I was like, I like reading those things.
Yeah.
And he was
like
like,
a dream student for me. I'd be so happy.
And he was just shaming me in class. He was like, you shouldn't be reading like fiction books. Instead, like you should stop going to Popular and like stop looking at the bestsellers on the shelves, and like he's like, go and like do some actual like research on what good books are. I'm like, you tagged me from the whole class. Now I look like an idiot, like you not only shame like something that I thought I had interest in, but also you shame me in front of my classmates. I was
That's
like,
awful.
Yeah,
that's awful. I'm so sorry that happened. Yeah, no, that is really awful. There is a lot of this idea that and it shows this ignorance and also this real fear of books, that people are really fearful that what is happening, this intimate experience that you are having with written words on the page, is changing you in ways that they cannot participate in unless they're also reading the same thing. Like people don't get so up in arms if you say, oh yeah, I binged all of this like Unorthodox on Netflix. They're like, oh, that's an experience that I can also have.
Yeah.
But when you're like, oh my God, I spent all day in bed reading this book, it was so good, you tend to get a lot of like eyebrow raising. You tend to get a lot of, why don't you get a life? Or like, or at least I do. But
No, but it's
also,
true. It's true.
yeah, a lot of suspicion. And I think there was a lot of suspicion around the intimate relationship that I had with books, because it couldn't lead to anything good. You were, if you loved books and you were fanciful, you were living in an imaginative world, you couldn't be in touch with reality.
You're stuck in your head, right?
Yeah, and actually so many ways in which I learned to cope with reality, like empathizing with people, like understanding that the world is so much more varied than than it appears to be, came from fictional books, because fiction is often about truths. It's adjacent to the truth. So yeah, to me that suspicion is something that's very that created a lot of shame, and something that I really had to work around, because I was very, very ashamed of writing stories. I think I was told that there was a place for it, like in composition class, to get an A. Yes, write a good story, and yes, you're a good writer, but there's a place for that. But if I wanted to write on my own, it was just like, yeah, it was seen as it was dismissed very quickly. It was seen as, why are you making up all these stories? And it was seen like, oh, so what, you sit around and lie all the time? Like, you just like, you make up things. It took me a long time to actually get past that. Yeah, I remember there was a particular there were a couple probably, but I remember a teacher in school, in primary 3. So I think a group of friends and I like started our own like detective club or something. Like, it was based on a book that we had all read, and we started writing our own stories. And very quickly I realized that there were these like salacious or like taboo things in stories that I didn't quite understand, like that had to do with like I think I must have gotten hold of a romance novel at some point, and there was some very exciting things happening in this romance novel that we didn't fully understand. And so we started like writing in that style. We started writing like those scenes as well and passing them around. And I think that's probably one of our earliest like ways of learning about sex, probably in the same way that the widows in Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows kind of developed their knowledge about sex years and years after the first time, because there was so much silence around it. They share details, and then one day, like the class tattletale or someone, I can't remember who, someone infiltrated our group clearly and told the teacher about it. And I just remember there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of like the other girls were like, oh, the teacher found out and you were the one who made us do this, you started this. So they all kind of distanced themselves from me. And then we were supposed to take our bags out for PE with us, like we always did. And that one day the teacher said, oh, leave your bags here when you go off for PE. And she gave me a look. And when I came back and we all came back to our bags, my folder full of stories had been taken from my bag. She confiscated it out of my bag. And she kind of joked about it later in the year, and she kind of said, oh, when are you going to come and get your stories from me? But that trust had been broken, right? Like, to take something, and there was just so much, I didn't want to really confront her. I didn't really want, and I was so young. I was like 8 years old. And I didn't really understand what I had done wrong. Yeah. Because, but there was so much shame associated with it that it stuck with me for a while. It was like, you need to grow out of this. You need to and this exploration in stories that you enjoy so much is because you have a dirty mind. There's that idea, it's like you love stories so much, you enjoy them so much because there's something wrong with you. Yep. That I found really frustrating, and I wonder if that is something that boys experience too. I'm not sure. I felt like as a girl in a Catholic school, there was a lot of shame associated with retreating into a world that was not the world that everyone else was in. Like having that independence to go into other worlds and to find things out for myself. There was something very dangerous about that.
How did you then break out of it?
For a very long time, I continued to try to write very well in composition class. I always got kind of, I think, the praise from teachers in that regard, like within the confines of, you know, the rubric for composition, kind of fueled me. But then for a while then in my teens, I just didn't write anything. And I just went, no, this is a silly, fanciful thing. And then I think it was when I was in grade 10, I went to an international school by that point. I had a teacher who assigned like a short story to us, and we actually didn't do any creative writing in that class. It was you know, by kind of like JC onwards, you're just doing kind of GP type essays, and you're not like, suddenly again creativity is abandoned. Like creativity is just, it's not important. We're writing serious things now. We're debating topics, and she just said, I'm so sick of all of you writing all these, like, you know, discussion topics and these big expositional essays. I just want you to write something fun. So write a creative story for homework based on the novel that we're reading. And I wrote the story that I put a lot of my heart into. It had been a very long time since I had written anything creative, and then I crammed it at the bottom of my school bag and refused to hand it in. And she kind of hounded me about it for about 2 weeks. She said, you're going to get a 0, hand it in, like hand in what you've written. And I was like, no, I can't. And she was just like, look, whatever you have, just hand it in. Otherwise, you know, you're going to fail your class. Yeah, so my teachers handed back my work to me, and she wrote, this is so good that I'm going to forgive its lateness. Whatever you do, you must keep writing. And that was really the thing that, I think that's the reason that I'm here today, actually. You know, I think it was just this, someone saw me. Gosh, I'm going to get emotional. Someone saw that I had this desire to write, that I had a story to tell, and that I love to do this so much. And someone said, you need to keep doing this. Clearly, this is something you love to do. This is something you're good at doing. And yeah, that's how that desire to write kind of became revived, and then I haven't stopped since.
I want to ask a bit about going back to the whole idea of like arts and culture, because we are doing this episode with Singapore Writers Festival, right? I think that the literary scene in Singapore in the last couple of years has grown quite a bit. But you know, if there was any like young listeners or like aspiring like writers who might be tuning into this, right, what are some words of encouragement or like some piece of advice that you might give them?
I would say to read widely. It's amazing how many people approach me to say that they want to write a book, but they don't particularly like to read, which is very strange.
It just points at self-indulgence. Sorry, that was so rude, but you know.
I do wonder sometimes if some people understand what it takes to write a book, or is it about having your name on you know, something that is permanent and that will outlive you, maybe. But yeah, I think reading widely. I think not being afraid to take risks with the things that you read as well as the things that you write. And also, I mean, this is advice just in general for young people, and not just for writers, but it's perfectly okay to be conflicted and confused about what it is you're supposed to be, who it is you're supposed to be, and what it is you're supposed to like. Think of it more as being complex rather than being conflicted, or complex rather than being confused, because I think there is a lot of pressure for us to be a particular identity or to know who we are. And I think the older we get, the more we realize that it's actually a work in progress. But so many people seem to think that there's a deadline, there's a cutoff point by which they need to have figured it all out. And it just doesn't have to be that linear. Dancing in uncharted waters, intertwined. Intimacy dresses themselves in red, red, red. Tones stark and distinct, and the depths and spirit of an unmapped sea drape around their body, a confidential secret, an adventure unlike any other. Feet first, engulfed in cold water leaves my bones parched, Seared by ignited flames of fear, my sight was eclipsed by the embers in mimic of a skull, a crossbone, a hushed cut of an internal scream, a warning of mislaid trust, a loss of control, and unforeseen pain. Feet in up to the waist, it becomes a warm embrace, akin to sharing a plate of mala with a loved one, buying chicken essence for your child before examinations, or even sitting on the steps along Singapore River with a friend or two and more talking, laksa cup noodles in hands, and more. Intimacy is naked in skin, in fleshy rose-colored tones, tender beneath the complexities. It is raw and honest, crude and beautiful. A sacred connection, a dance with skin, flesh, bones, and hearts. And I hope to come around and accept them with open arms this time.
That was quite beautiful, I would say. It's really out of my depth. I'm not a poetry lover, I have to admit. But I really liked... I mean, the thing that I think jumped out to me the most was that when they were talking about intimacy, it wasn't just like sexual. You know, there was a lot of connotations about connections with like friends and like family. Right, that line, a secret connection, a dance with skin, flesh, bone, and hearts. It's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought the writer did a lot to kind of try to define intimacy
Yeah.
in terms of universal things, like, you know, the color red,
The color, food.
yeah, like big broad things, but then also very, very specific experiences, right? Like you got a sense that this is what the writer also thinks of intimacy for themselves.
Yep.
Like intimacy, you know, with the loved ones, or walking along the Singapore River or something. So
Buying chicken essence for your child before examinations.
Yeah, so kind of trying to understand this very, very big word in the context of their experience.
You used to turn up the volume of the radio each time Natalie and Brulia came on. Baby, it's your song, naked on the floor. You would burst into peals of laughter. I would just shake my head and yell back, Mummy, it was just once. When will you ever let it go? You'd found me on the bathroom floor a few years ago when I'd fainted during a shower. I remember waking up to your worried face as you covered me with a towel and tried to lift me upright. Last October, it was my turn to see you naked. In 35 years, I only caught glimpses of your limbs in your uniform of modest shirts and sarongs. Today, I'm here to wash you as your body lay before me at your last rites. The women of the family huddled over you as the smell of Lux soap bars permeated through the small and humid room. Lift her, wash, gently, gently. Okay, now put her down. Echoed through the titled walls as the lead washer belted out instructions as we bathed you. Hot tears stung and obscured my view as I told myself to hold it together. It was my last act of love for you. I had to be strong. Snot dripped down my nose as I worried that they would accidentally desecrate your cleansed cadaver. Mummy, you're so beautiful, I thought to myself as I dabbed you dry. I lost it when she stuffed cotton balls in your nostrils. This was my favorite.
Yeah, this is beautiful.
I know.
Yeah. I think the contrast between the two paragraphs, like the contrast between the earlier scene where the mum is so full of life, and so funny, like that relationship between them, I think is so is established so well at the beginning, and then it kind of feeds into the intimacy and the very brutal reality. It leads into really nicely to this the reality of kind of doing the last rites and having this duty towards her mother's body. There's something very the author clearly understands the vulnerability of the final rites, and has also managed to kind of draw us into that world really well with the opening scene. I just think it's very well done.
Very heartbreaking. I think especially like the very last sentence.
Yeah.
When she stuffed cotton in your nostrils.
Yeah.
Very sad. Yeah.
In my previous relationships, I realized that we did not have intimacy. They were filled with walls, fortified with anger and insecurity, and offered no room for vulnerability, especially for crying. Past partners were so uncomfortable with crying or comforting me. Instead, tears were met with defensive remarks and debilitating statements. The lack of respect, comfort, and consent on many occasions left me angry, disappointed, and broken. I met my current partner soon after. Our relationship survived and flourished even when I thought it was doomed before it began. Sharing details of my trauma with my partner was terrifyingly intimate, but I found a reservoir of patience and kindness. Soon I felt empowered by his support to begin counseling and join a support group. In return, my partner trusted me enough to cry and let me comfort him, something no one else but I had seen. In time, we climbed out of our holes and empathized with one another's struggles. I now understand what intimacy is: liberation, respect, consent, joy, vulnerability, and a warm blanket on a very rainy day.
I relate to it a lot more, I think, with like talking about partnership and like, I don't know if, especially like for women around my age, right, whether they would really understand what it means to be valued or to have like an intimate connection with somebody unless they start valuing themselves first. So I don't know, I do see a bit of yeah,
it's a very direct piece. I think that there's something that's very this person is very directly addressing this idea of intimacy, and again it comes back to that definition of intimacy. It's so interesting that that we define intimacy so much according to our experience with it, and this person is clearly talking about what wasn't there, what didn't constitute intimacy, and then discovering what intimacy was because of what was absent before. I think that's very powerful.
I think it's very interesting that you said that. I think a lot of us immediately, when we talk about intimacy, we immediately talk about our own relationship and experiences with it.
Yeah.
How would you then
how would I define it? Yeah, I think in that same way, in terms of like, I mean, the immediate thing that comes to mind is how do I experience intimacy, or what is intimacy to me, or I just think that, and in terms of those 5 different types of intimacies that you mentioned as well, like that makes me think even more about defining it on very personal terms.
It's very hard to separate it from something that's so personal
and experience, right? Too, like you have to connect it to personal experience. Like I don't think intimacy was something I particularly thought about as a word or as something to define when I was younger, like when I was a kid. Intimate, that word. Same. And then now it just seems more and more a bigger priority, I would say.
But I'd just like to thank you.
This was
coming
really
down
fun
and doing this with us. It was really nice having you.
Tune in to the full episode on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcast, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.